Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Texas Public Policy Foundation's Thursday live stream series. I'm James Quintero, and this is Zoning Out. Does Texas have a de facto zoning problem? Spoiler alert, I think it does. Today, we're going to be looking at Houston's historic preservation law. We're going to assess its impact on property rights. We're going to examine a fascinating case before the Texas Supreme Court that could have far-reaching consequences both in the Bayou City and beyond. And to help me unpack all of this are three of the smartest scholars I know, and I'm not saying that just to suck up either. Our speakers today are really some intellectual giants, and we are honored to have them with us. The first that I'd like to introduce is Professor Matt Festa, who is a professor of law at the South Texas College of Law. Professor, it's always a pleasure to have you with us. Thank you for being here. Next up, we have Arif Panju, who is the managing attorney for the Institute of Justice's Texas office. Arif is absolutely brilliant. Arif, thank you again for being back with us. And last, but certainly not least, we have one of the foundation's own superstar litigators, Mr. Chance Weldon. Chance has done absolutely incredible work on the local litigation front and continues to do good work with his case here. So Chance, thank you for joining us as well. So gentlemen, with the introductions out of the way, let's jump right in. And Professor, I'd actually like to go to you first. Since you are kind of closest to the action in some sense, can you provide us with an overview of Houston's historic preservation ordinance and why it caught your attention?
Thanks, James, and I'd be glad to. I know that we've all want to hear from the other panelists as well, and we kind of envision this as a free-flowing back and forth discussion. I understand there's a way to ask questions on the live stream, perhaps as well. So we want a discussion about. I'll just take a few extra minutes at the beginning here to provide the background and set up the case itself, but also kind of the history of it. So, as a starting point, all lawyers know and all Houstonians know the reputation that Houston has as the only major American city without a formal official zoning code. Right? So Houston has this reputation of relative laxity compared to cities that have zoning codes. But that doesn't mean Houston doesn't have a lot of land use rules that operate like zoning and read like zoning, and as we argue in this case, actually are de facto zoning. So just to kind of the 100-year perspective, when zoning became a thing about 100 years ago, cities started to do it. States enacted specific statutes to allow municipalities with certain, under certain substantive and procedural guidance that's above and beyond general home rule police powers. And I know that my co-panelists are going to talk a lot about some of those cases and the impact on the law. Houston, the reason Houston does not have a formal zoning code is because the voters of Houston were asked 3 times in 3 separate referendum, one in the 40s, one in the 60s, and the last one in 1993. And the people of Houston, the voters, said, no, we don't want zoning. And in 1994 took an additional step of putting it in the city charter, no zoning, unless we amend the charter. The charter is essentially like the constitution of a city. It's the basic ground rules that constrain the council and the mayor and the government. Right? So we say we don't have zoning. But in the mid-90s, shortly after that, Houston enacted its original historic preservation ordinance, which allowed for the creation by petitions of property owners to create historic districts. And this wasn't really a problem for its first 15 years because it didn't really have any teeth. It was more of a sort of a guidelines and suggestions. But after 90 days, there were little extra hoops to jump through. but after 90 days, the property owner could make modifications without special dispensation by the city architectural and historic commission. In 1910, these rules got teeth. And just to give you a couple examples, this thing here is almost 200 pages, depending on how your printer works, of specific guidelines that apply to one historic district in the Heights of Houston. These range from how you can replace, things from roofing and windows and exterior. They're mostly exterior, but they're pretty strict. And it takes the default presumption of property rights from yes to no. You can't build things without all this extra permission. There's all these restrictions. It's pretty comprehensive. And that's where my clients come in. Kathleen Powell and Paul Lucia. So James asked, why am I interested? I've been talking about this for my career as a land use professor. The de facto ways that regulations can operate like zoning, even if they're not called zoning, and the implications for private property rights. So that's what I've been interested in as a scholar and a researcher and a teacher. But my clients live in one of these historic districts, Kathleen and Paul, who, by the way, are very involved in city politics for a long time. So they paid attention to what's going on, and they thought that this was something that was wrong. This level of interference with private property, and my clients are lifelong Democratic Party advocates. So it's not what I always say about land use is you can't really kind of predict land use politics based on kind of national political identification. This affects individual rights. So just a quick summary of the lawsuit, and then I'll turn it over to my other panelists. My client sued, claiming that this historic preservation districting law, now we have no quibble with historic landmarking or the concept of historic preservation itself. My clients and I yield to no one in our love for history. But drawing a line on a map, I'll show you a visual here in a second, and saying there's different rules inside the line and outside the line. We argue that those rules fall under the zoning statute of the Texas legislature, and they actually constitute zoning, even though the legislature provided a specific way to do it, which the city didn't do. And the voters of Houston have said, we don't want it, which the city basically went around in our arguments. So those are our arguments. Number one, this is zoning. Number two, it violates state law. Number three, it violates the charter. So cutting to the chase, there was a trial with some really good trial lawyers before I got in the case, but the city prevailed and then went to the Court of Appeal, and now it's before the Texas Supreme Court. We're very proud to have gotten this case all the way up to oral argument at the Texas Supreme Court, because as many of you probably know, they have discretion over their docket, and the court only hears a small percentage of the petitions. So we're proud to have gotten this far, and we thought that the briefing and the oral argument went well, especially because we had the outstanding support of amicus briefs from the Texas Public Policy Foundation, from the Institute for Justice, from the Texas Attorney General, and from a group of state legislators who agree with our argument and that this case is important. So let me just kind of wrap up my spiel here with a couple visuals, if I can share my screen, just to give you a sense of it. It's not going to be death by PowerPoint. I save that fate for my law students. But if I can, so James, are we seeing the screen? Is this?
You got it.
You got it, okay. So just real quick, a couple visuals. So these maps, were the original designations when these two historic districts were drawn. And again, this is the way the ordinance works is you have to get 10% of the property owners to start the process. That's a pretty small number, right? And then once the process starts, originally, I think it's 2/3 now, but originally you just needed, if I'm correct, 51% of the owners to say yes, although there were some, this was an issue at trial, it's not really up at the Supreme Court, but my clients argued that the city counted abstentions as yes votes, essentially. Or if you didn't vote no, it was counted towards the majority. But the shaded end property owners were the ones that said yes. And you can see these lines are essentially, I mean, I think it's accurate and fair to say gerrymandered, right? Properties that aren't in the district, there's not necessarily rhyme or reason to it. I mean, there can be based on individual properties, but you can kind of see how the lines are drawn in a way that whether you're in the district or out depends on how they chose to draw the line. And again, these 200 pages of guidelines restrict people within the district and not those across the street. So that's why we think this is really, it looks like zoning, it operates like zoning. It's the districting that the districting under the state law that says zoning means regulating by district for height, use, density, building, lot size, and historic preservation falls under Chapter 211 of the Local Government Code.
And so Professor, just to clarify, effectively, if you want to do, if a person in that jurisdiction wanted to do anything within the realm of aesthetics, they would need government's permission to do it. Is that correct?
That's essentially correct. Anything. I mean, if you wanted to put a pink plastic flamingo in your front yard, I'm not sure whether that's covered or not. But building alterations, construction, modifications, and some of these houses they don't really have historic value themselves. They're just in the district, and some of them really the owners want to tear them down and build something else, and the process does stop there. But again, it's mainly aesthetics, and I know Chance will probably talk about the legality and the property rights aspects of that as soon as I finish this opening spiel. This next slide, right? So one of the city's arguments is, well, it doesn't cover the whole city, so it's not zoning. But if you look at this map, which I pulled from the city's website, once you start adding, I think there's 22 historic districts now, it starts to cover a lot of ground, and it starts to look a lot more like zoning. Zoning's not, historic zoning is not supposed to cover the entire city. It's an overlay. It's an overlay to regulations that apply everywhere else. And that's what we're arguing. So my final visual for you, and then I'll yield, is it's not our argument in this case that other forms of regulation, all forms of regulation by district, may or may not be illegal de facto zoning. We're not making that argument here. But as a policy matter and as a discussion on property rights and government, the extent of local government power, historic preservation is just one of the many ways in which Houston, which is famously the unzoned city, at least in its reputation, regulates land in a lot of ways by district. And whether they fall under the zoning code or not, it's not our argument in this case. But just as a visual, this is from a report by Rice University that I co-authored a couple of years ago. When you add minimum lot size districts, historic districts, major activity centers, transit corridors, special parking districts, tax increment reinvestment zones, and then the big blue one at the bottom is airport zoning, which the FAA made us do it. So it's So that's there. But it starts to take up a lot of the city's land, and it starts to look a lot more like a traditional city. And the Rice University Kinder Institute report that I referenced, we studied Houston and Dallas and LA, and we found they're more alike than they are different. And the zoning code, the way Houston's land use regulations operate is much more like most other cities that are in its comparison group. So anyway, it's before the Texas Supreme Court. We had oral arguments last month, and my clients and I are proud to have gotten it this far. And as a professor, it's a great sort of topic that fits with my research and teaching. So but it is of statewide importance because it goes beyond Houston. Other cities in Texas need to be advised by the court on what is the scope of their powers under the state statutes and compliance with their own city charters. So this is an important issue for local government law and for property rights. And I have some thoughts which maybe we'll get to in the discussion about the policy implications, but I will stop for now and love to hear from the other panelists.
Well, that's a great overview, Professor, and I appreciate that. Excellent visuals. Chance, why don't you jump in here, because if I'm not mistaken, you recently participated in the oral argument before the Texas Supreme Court on this case, articulating the foundation's perspective. Can you share with us kind of why TPPF got involved with this case in the first place?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I mean, on its face, if you take a look at it, it seems like a very niche sort of Houston issue about Houston's charter and historic zoning and things like that. But the issues in the case are a lot broader. I know that, for the past couple of decades, what we've seen is cities are increasingly acting in sort of a lawless manner where they disregard, whether that be state law, like when they've passed paid sick leave ordinances, or whether that be the state constitution with sort of our short-term rental regulation challenges that we've had in this state. We've seen cities ignoring the law a lot, but seeing a city ignore its own charter was sort of a new low of lawlessness. And so we were interested in that. But I think more importantly was the city's argument as to the scope of its ability to regulate land use generally. And that's because that ran counter to a line of cases in Texas we think is really important for the preservation of private property rights in Texas. And this goes back to a Texas Supreme Court case called Spann versus Dallas. And what Spann versus Dallas did is it laid out 3 criteria for land use regulation that are unique to Texas. First, it said, if you're going to regulate land use regulations have to be based in harm or nuisance. For example, you can't have a dynamite factory next to a school because that could be potentially harmful, but the city can't come in and tell you what color that you need to paint your shutters, right? That would be beyond the scope of city's land use authority. And that's because the right to own property in Texas is considered a natural right, just like the freedom of speech or other natural rights recognized under the Constitution. The second is that land use regulation has to be based on objective criteria. It can't be just based on subjective preferences of one's neighbors. You have to point to some sort of objective criteria that lays out why this is a nuisance or harmful. And the third thing that Spann did is it said that whenever someone challenges a land use regulation, courts are going to look to reality. They're going to look to the actual evidence in the record, and they're going to look and see whether or not the thing being regulated is a nuisance or a harmful use of private property in fact, or whether or not it's not harmful and it's just the city trying to claim that something's a nuisance when it's not a nuisance in fact. And what the city did here, because the city doesn't have the authority to zone, is it claimed it had this sort of inherent authority to engage in aesthetic land use regulations. And everything down to the color that you paint the bricks on your home under its inherent police power. And we thought that undermined this very important line of cases, which is the Spann line of cases. And therefore we got involved, and Professor Festa was kind enough to give us some oral argument time that we got to raise these issues before the Texas Supreme Court.
Now, Chance, you made reference to the fact that Spann was decided a long time ago. Does that mean it's out of date? Is it still good case law?
It's absolutely still good case law. Texas courts have continued. As a matter of fact, as recent as 2010, several members of the Texas Supreme Court were still citing DeSpan. We recently had the Austin Court of Appeals cite DeSpan in our short-term rental case, where we struck down the city of Austin's regulations on short-term rentals. So it's still good law in Texas, but it's different, and it's understandably different from federal law.
Now I've heard the city argue that it takes a little bit different view, at least as it relates to SPAN. And the city of Houston, I believe, has argued that Euclid v. Ambler actually supersedes SPAN. Is that your interpretation of the matter as well?
Yeah, I mean, without getting too nerdy into the legal aspects of it, that's a real problem, because Euclid was a United States Supreme Court decision interpreting the United States Constitution. And SPAN is a Texas Supreme Court case interpreting the Texas Constitution. And the way that our federal system works is that states can provide greater protections for private property rights or for any rights than what the federal Constitution provides. And that's what Texas courts have done with regard to property rights. And so there's actually a little bit of an interesting history to this. And I wanted to point this out because the city relies on Euclid, and a lot of land use preservationists tend to rely on Euclid. So it's really important to understand the history of this, because it has a particularly ugly history. For time immemorial, for over 100 years, all courts, federal and state courts, applied this SPAN standard that you can regulate private property rights, private property uses, unless the private property use was actually harmful, was actually a nuisance. And this goes into about 1918, 1919. You get a case called Buchanan versus Worley before the United States Supreme Court, where they had enacted a racial zoning ordinance, where they said that Black individuals could not own homes in white neighborhoods. And, some 40 years before Brown versus Board of Education, the United States Supreme Court struck that down as unconstitutional, noting that having a Black person live next to you was not a common law nuisance, right? That's a regular human being living next to you. That's not harmful use of property. So therefore, under this traditional SPAN framework, even in prior to 1920, this was unconstitutional. Well, cities got clever several years later, and they devised a new set of land use regulations based on neighborhood character. And this is what actually forms the genesis of all of this sort of like aesthetic-based zoning that we have today, was in fact cities trying to keep certain people out of neighborhoods based on this amorphous neighborhood character. And in Euclid, that was the first time that the United States Supreme Court upheld neighborhood character as a valid basis for land use regulation. But the Texas Supreme Court, like less than 5 years later, comes back and says, nope, we're not going to follow Euclid. We're going to continue to follow SPAN. And you cannot regulate private property unless it's a harmful use or a nuisance-based use of private property. And the Texas Supreme Court and Texas courts have refused to follow Euclid for the past century, and rightly so. And that's one of the reasons that it's easier to own a home in Texas. It's one of the reasons it's easier to own a business in Texas. It's one of the reasons it's cheaper to live in Texas than places like California that follow this Euclid standard, because the Texas Supreme Court and Texas courts have realized that property ownership is a natural right. And if you want to regulate property ownership, you need a good reason. And so, yeah.
Sorry. Oh, I just wanted to add to not only that, but Euclid only stands for the idea that zoning isn't a constitutional violation. It doesn't mean it's inherent in home rule police powers, because what happened around the time of Euclid was every state, including Texas, passed a specific zoning enabling act. So a question we've never gotten a good answer to is, why would they have done that if you could do zoning under home rule?
Great question. And Arif, let me bring you in here, because I've had the pleasure of reading through IJ's amicus brief to the Texas Supreme Court. And for anybody who wants a great history on property rights with a particular focus on SPAN, I encourage you to read the brief. But one of the things that I think you guys did quite so well is articulate that that the private property protections provided under the Texas Constitution are a little bit different than those provided through the U.S. Constitution and or federal laws. And I was hoping that you might be able to elaborate a little bit more on that.
Yeah, and I'm glad that Chance teed that up. I mean, IJ weighed in this case because state constitutions matter. And they matter precisely because they can provide greater protections than the federal constitution. Federal constitution sets a floor of how robustly certain rights must be protected. And the Texas Constitution and any other state constitution can both protect more rights and protect them more robustly. In fact, the Texas Constitution protects more rights than the U.S. Constitution. The Texas Supreme Court made that clear in the Patel case, the eyebrow threading case, which was an economic liberty case, and said the due course of law provision protects more rights, including property rights. And it protects those rights more robustly than the federal courts do. I think just taking a step back, people are watching this and it's a controversy in Houston, and this is a neighborhood battles and historic zoning, but this has statewide implications, which is why the Texas Supreme Court took the case. And so why is this important? I think it's important to recognize that upon attaining statehood, Texas designed its state constitution to protect more rights. So we have that established. And if you look at the Texas clause that's at issue in this case, it goes beyond protections against taking property, which is what the federal constitution protects against eminent domain and against regulatory takings, but that's protects against taking property. In Texas, our clause protects, precludes not only unconstitutional takings, but also damaging and destroying property as well. And so this principle is enshrined in the Constitution, in our state constitution, and the respect for property rights that Texas has and that Texans had when they were framing the Constitution really reflects a really simple but really profound principle, and that is that property rights are natural rights. They pre-existed the Constitution. They pre-existed the government that's enforcing the laws in Houston and everywhere else. So this means that property rights are not automatically subordinate to the will of city council members down in Houston that want to use the police power to regulate property use. And that's what's going on. And that's what's at issue in the Powell case. And why? And that's because Texas courts they've repeatedly recognized that under our state constitution, the right to use property is inseparable from the right to own property. And thus, if the government, has the ability to regulate use, that power is inherently limited. And that's what's really enshrined in the span line of cases. Courts apply the Texas Constitution, and in the context of property rights, they have cemented this conceptual understanding into Texas law. And so the distinction here, which I want to impress upon the audience, is that property owners are free to use property as long as it's not harmful. And that property right protections extend to that predates modern constitutional law altogether. Just a quick note about what happened after Spann and why Houston's worried about it. So, in the face of this strong precedent and these underpinnings that are foundational in the Spann precedent, and Spann was a case against the city of Dallas, and they wanted to some people wanted to have business houses where you can only have residence houses, and this kind of predated Euclid. There in that situation, property owners could you needed to convince your neighbors basically that you could build this on your own land. And that's where Spann, kind of flourishes, where it kind of provides this robust understanding of property rights. So Houston has argued that Spann has been gradually eroded or discredited to the point of convenient obsolescence, which happens to coincide with the fact that they're ignoring their charter and basically zoning people in neighborhoods based on what a small fraction of the neighborhood thinks other people's homes are supposed to look like. This happens across the state, and it's a problem, but that's a separate question. So after Spann, it's important to note that the Supreme Court of Texas reaffirmed its commitment to Spann just 2 years after it was decided in Crossman v. Galveston. Galveston had an ordinance that said, look, all these dilapidated buildings are nuisances, and so we can condemn dilapidated property, even if it poses no actual threat to public health and safety, which is insane. Invoking Spann, the court voided the ordinance as an unconstitutional grant of power. A decade later, Supreme Court of Texas comes back, applied Spann again in the first of many post-Euclid decisions. In Lombardo v. Dallas, for example, there was an ordinance about that operated to prohibit the construction of gasoline filling stations in a residential area. The court did not conclude that the ordinance was improper in light of SPAN, so it didn't come out the way that the challengers wanted it, but it nevertheless reaffirmed SPAN's important limitation on the police power to regulate property and applied the SPAN analysis in its decision. This vitality in terms of courts robustly protecting property rights continues today. In 2010, for example, the Supreme Court relied heavily on SPAN in its decision in Robinson v. Crown Cork and Seal Company. Justice Willett writes prolifically in that opinion. And in that opinion in Robinson, the court explained that determining whether a law is impermissibly retroactive depends on whether it is a valid exercise of the police power, and again, relying on SPAN. And so the court ultimately invalidated the statute, with two justices citing SPAN's police power discussion as a key resource for weighing private right against the government's asserted planning interests. And that is really the question before the Texas Supreme Court in Powell. And we insist that it applies SPAN, and it rejects the city's self-serving argument that because it wants to just zone historic districts, that the rest of the Texas population here and anyone else that comes here in the future and has property they want to own and use has protections that make sure that continues into the future. And so, that's why IJ weighed in. And, we think that TPPF and Professor Festa have properly positioned the case. And we're eager to see what the decision is. But this is a juicy issue.
Well, I think that's well said, Arif. And one thing that you guys noted in your brief is that while the city of Houston considers SPAN a quote unquote jurisprudential dead letter, it is in fact not. And furthermore, one thing that I think your brief does well is lays out the argument that historic preservations may be being deployed as a tool to prevent people from doing what they want with their own property. And I wonder if you might expand on that point.
Yeah. So the prolific writing, to the extent it's prolific, and it is, because it's not mine, it's my colleague Ari Bargil, who is excellent and did all the great stuff for that brief. But Ari also litigated a case along with some of my other colleagues at IJ against the city of Dallas we call it the Hinga case, Hinga Automotive. And to provide an example of how this it extends in the real world to other examples of property right violations, Hinga just wanted to do what he's been doing for years, which is fix cars. He's a mechanic. He's in a mechanic shop on Ross Avenue. But Ross Avenue just happens to be the now entryway to the nice design district in downtown Houston where they have the performing arts centers. So they want to get rid of Hinga so they can put up a macaroni grill. And I'm not just making that up. That was actually an example cited by the city council members. So they used something called amortization, where they basically extinguish the use that Hinga can put his property to, using it to repair cars and have his mechanic shop there. And we took that case up. The Dallas Court of Appeals got it wrong. And SPAN laid in the background. The Texas Supreme Court did not take up that case. And now it's being asked to take up a different case involving short-term rentals that TPPF is litigating, where SPAN again hangs there, the same line of cases that were at issue in the amortization case. And so whether you're dealing with short-term rentals, whether you're dealing with trying to extinguish business owners from running their businesses by using their property, using amortization, which is just eminent domain by another name and needs to be treated as such by courts, SPAN protects property owners' ability to use their land. And so it's important for the Texas Supreme Court to lay this foundational benchmark that local governments and the state or anyone else that wields the power the government has can't cross. And so this affects more than just historic districts. This affects more than short-term rentals, more than amortization. If you want to use your property in a certain way that doesn't hurt anyone and doesn't create risk to the public health and safety, SPAN protects your right to use the land that way in a robust manner that's consistent with the promise enshrined in the Constitution of the state. And that's why it matters that the Texas Supreme Court get this question correct.
Well said. And let me remind our audience, in a few minutes, we're going to open up to audience Q&A. So be sure to get your questions ready. But in the meantime, let me throw out a counter argument that the opposition I've seen in a few different places. And what they'll frequently say is, people can build new buildings, but they can't build historic buildings. And because of that rationale, That's why we need such stringent historic preservation laws. Does anybody want to tackle that criticism?
Yeah, I can. I mean, what we need and what we want and what's legal are not necessarily the same thing. The Texas legislature allows cities to have historic preservation districts, but it's in the zoning code, right? So, and why is this important beyond Houston as well? Again, my clients and I, we love history and we love historic preservation. If I wanted to be a little bit cynical, I've read basically every contemporary book about historic preservation. And one, sort of takeaway I have is they tend to focus very little on preserving history and more about how you can use this tool to shape your neighborhood or to stop development, right? So, and that's why the Texas legislature put this in the zoning code. So, and this is different from a historic landmark. That's not what this case is about. It's about districting, wrapping in both contributing and non-contributing properties by geographic boundary and using historic preservation as a way to essentially do zoning, which the Texas legislature in the last session reaffirmed historic. In fact, the legislature added a provision that says you can't do this anymore without the consent of the property owner. So that shows that the legislature considers historic districts to be zoning.
Professor Bussa said something important. I'd like to seize on it and just piggyback on it if I could, James. This is not about historic landmarks. It's about historic districts. And if you want to see the type of wrecking ball historic districts causes in our communities, you can go to YouTube and just Google controversy Bluebonnet Hills to see exactly what happened in Austin when they tried to wreck this neighborhood in the first neighborhood south of Town Lake in South Austin, a very eclectic and funky town. There was one historic landmark, which was already a historic landmark, nothing else that looked like that. This was just an effort to control the people that were moving into the neighborhood from being able to build a home and live their life on their land in the home they dreamed of. And the preservationists came out and said, we have a right to see what we want outside of our window. That's our right. So we can control and cram this down on you. And they proceeded to try to do that. I mean, this had no consensus. It was a 50-50 split in the neighborhood. And so it got up to the city council and eventually got defeated, thankfully. But if you want to see what it looks like, just hearing the neighbors, that short video, while that on the eve of the city council meeting in this historic district battle, when it came to a head, controversy, Bluebonnet Hills. And what you'll see is neighbors that are just explaining, this is just a neighborhood. It's a eclectic neighborhood. It's about people living here. And forcing this on us is just a wrecking ball that just takes away our ability to make our window bigger. Or maybe we want to move the door somewhere else or add something on the side of the house. But of course, it would change the character of the neighborhood. A very subjective characteristic that is used to extinguish people's ability to do what they want with their homes. And that's often done at historic landmark commissions where you have preservationists sitting on boards and you're forced to funnel through there to do anything with your home. That's what historic districts do. And it's profoundly offensive to property rights that districts aren't something that's done voluntarily on a homeowner by homeowner basis when you already have landmarking that's an option for the real landmarks. And instead is crammed down on people as a, quote, tool to control development or to control basically your use of property. And so this particular case before the Texas Supreme Court about historic districts has this against the background because everything's old. The clock will keep ticking. The calendar pages will keep turning. And just because it's old doesn't make it historic. But under the guise of historicism and preservation, these attempts to have these historic districts as this hammer to stop people from buying their homes and making it their home is profoundly offensive to what we would expect our Constitution to protect at a baseline.
Well, I find myself identifying with that everything is old sentiment more and more these days. But Arif, let me ask you something real quick. If a person gets effectively captured against their will in one of these districts, what's the process to extricate themselves out? Or is there one?
Yeah, there is not. The people that get caught up in this, some things that they do when it's almost inevitable is before it's finally enacted, they'll get some sort of quick building permit and do a renovation, make their window larger to become a non-contributing structure. The contributing structures, which are, the houses that were there that are just older, they're subject to extremely onerous rules. The non-contributing structures are also subject to rules, but not as many because they've already been altered, so they're non-contributing. But then you still have to make sure you're not detracting from the character of the neighborhood, which is where they get you anyways. So anytime you want to do something, once you're inside this district, you're funneled to this landmark commission, and these people just randomly get to decide based on what they think looks good or not good, what you can do with your own property. That is a problem. And it's a problem that's spreading, and which is why when it's happening in Houston in this manner, it's important for the court in the context of this type of case to recognize that, if someone wants to, if a city has a legitimate landmarking program and they want to voluntarily participate in it, okay, despite the fact that it's just funneling taxpayer money to help them not pay their property taxes and they don't have to reinvest it in their home, it's just a handout. But okay, they protect the landmark. But in historic districts, that's not the case. And it's important to let folks know because it's increasingly being used to loop people in under the guise of historicism to control what their house looks like, all the things you'd have in an HOA without having an HOA, but having government power make it happen. Mm-hmm. And that's a problem. And when enforcement happens, that's a problem. You're subject to fines. You could be subject to jail time because you're violating zoning ordinances. And so there's repercussions for homeowners. It's more expensive to maintain homes. And that's not okay as a matter of policy. I think as a matter of constitutional law, it's important to decide the span line of cases and reaffirm it in the context of historic districts, because it has to constitutionally recalibrate what's been really going off the rails behind the scenes now for several years, especially as many people are moving to Texas and into the cities. This is very prevalent and it's an ongoing and concrete problem. The legislature addressed partially some of it, but just by saying, look, you can't just a majority vote 5-4 of the Historic Landmark Commission force even a landmark against someone's will. You need a kind of a little bit of a supermajority. This Texas legislature can do more, as we all could, but the Texas Supreme Court has the opportunity to do exactly what needs to be done at the precise moment when it needs to happen. And so we sincerely hope that that's what's happening. And that's what we asked for in our brief.
Chance, I can feel your property rights spider sense going off. Do you want to jump in here?
No, I think it really, it touches on an important point. The question is like, well, how does this affect open space, or how does this, isn't historic preservation a good thing? And at the end of the day, the question here isn't whether or not historic preservation is a good thing. It's who bears the burden. Individuals in these districts, they want to make sure that what they look out their window looks the way they want it to look, right? And typically, if I want the benefit of a property, I have to pay for that property. And so what these programs are essentially their wealth transfers from one group of people who has a majority in that area, from the people who are in the minority in the voting in that area to the people who are in the majority of the voting in that area. It's government using force, it's government using fines, it's government using regulations to provide a benefit for one set of homeowners, taking it away from another, taking away the natural right to use your property for the benefit of someone else. So the question, we need to move the emphasis, and the Constitution is supposed to move the emphasis from, the question is not whether or not, historic buildings should be preserved, or whether or not, open spaces should be preserved, or whether or not, when we deal with tree ordinances and other things, the question is not whether or not that's good policy. The question is who bears the burden. And in our constitutional system, if you want the benefit of someone else's property, you have to pay for that. And you have to, if the city wants the benefit or the majority wants the benefit of someone else's property, they have to pay for that through taxes or whatever, through the eminent domain programs to get the benefit of it. You can't just transfer by majority vote the benefits of private property from one group of property owners to another. And that's exactly what they do with these sort of land use regulations. That's why it's important that we nip these things in the bud.
Can I add on to that real quick?
Please, please.
Not only that, but there are policy consequences that the public at large has to bear, because restrictive regulations like this limit entry to the community. They raise property values, they limit density, which contributes to sprawl, to gobbling up of open space in other areas. People got to live somewhere. So these, and again, this is a policy matter, not for me, not the legal issue in the case per se, but the more restrictive, these rules benefit the neighbors, like Chance said, but they also, at the cost of the property owners as individuals, but it also has consequences throughout the community by restricting the supply of housing. We have an affordable housing crisis all over the country. We have environmental concerns. And if you don't let people live somewhere, they're going to live somewhere else.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, just many cities throughout kind of the Midwest and the Northwest and the West Coast are cutting back on their historic preservation ordinances for that very reason, to increase access and affordability. These are progressive cities and states.
Yeah, it's really a situation where you have people come into these neighborhoods and then they want to sort of slam the door behind them. They've gotten their house, they have their place to live, and then they adopt these regulations to make it more difficult to build new housing, more difficult to modify existing housing, more expensive. They've got their little piece of the American dream and they want to close the door behind them. And I just don't think that's right.
Yeah, and Chance is right. You know, if you think about it too, all the stuff they want to preserve, if these historic district and historic regulations were around back when SPAN was being litigated, then, and let's say SPAN was not there, you would have prevented all sorts of architects or people with great design ideas from building homes that the same homes they want to preserve now those would have never sprung up. And, you know, especially now where you have a lot of people coming to Austin with resources because we have a good regulatory climate and we have protection of property rights. You know, come here and if you look around, just where I live in Austin, you drive around Austin and there's all sorts of cool architecture going on. I'm sure they're going to want to preserve that in the future. But these things are able to happen on people's land precisely because of precedent like SPAN, because it hasn't been, because it's been there to kind of calibrate what the government can do vis-a-vis what the rights are that they have to respect. And frankly, they exist to protect, not to stifle and to trample on. And so it's important to look at preservation through the lens of you're preserving things that based on your own regulations would not even exist if they were in place when the stuff was being built that you're seeking to preserve now decades later. And that's why you want to make sure that SPAN, despite it having a long history, that's to be celebrated, not a reason to not follow it. It's there because it preserves the ability to use land, including using it to build amazing things that preservationists may want to preserve in the future, but only if people want to do it voluntarily through a legitimate landmarking program, not using these districts to wipe out people and then also at the same time eviscerate the case law that made it possible to have amazing things in the first place.
Great, well said. Let's transition to the audience Q&A portion of the segment. And for anybody who hasn't gotten their question in, let me encourage you to do so. We actually have quite a few questions, but anything you send me, I'll do my best to address online. The first one, though, for the general group is what kind of precedent might this case set for other Texas cities? Does anybody want to tackle that one?
I'll just say real quick, it means cities have to follow the zoning code when they do zoning, which has different procedural and substantive constraints as opposed to general just home rule, whatever you want. And number two, cities have to pay attention to the scope of their own charters.
I think that's right. I think it says, you know, cities have to follow the Zoning Enabling Act. Cities have to follow their own charters. And then when they do, they have to be respective of SPAN and the line of cases that limits the authority to engage in zoning and everything else at the outset. So it's about cities recognizing that they are creatures of delegated and enumerated powers. and they have to stay within those.
It's pretty amazing that we have to remind cities to follow the law, but apparently that's where we are today. Professor, I believe this question is for you. Are there other ways that cities are limiting our property rights that we should be aware of or can look out for?
Well, so I'll take off my lawyer hat and be the professor on this one, because this is not an issue in the case. But that last slide I showed in my little intro spiel, minimum lot sizes, height restrictions, even something as simple as parking requirements do affect the property rights. Is that kind of the question? Are there other tools that governments are using that
Correct.
affect property rights? I mean, my whole point is that zoning, we call it zoning, but it's more than just what are you using the land for. It's the form, it's the structure, it's the way it affects the community. So there are many ways, and that's why, my scholarly position is that Houston does have de facto zoning. It's a lighter touch than in most cities, which is good, I believe, but it's a careful balance, and that's why this case is important, because there are many ways in which, and some are good. We want building safety codes. We don't want fire traps. There are important land use regulations, but the over-regulation leads to what I was just saying a couple minutes ago. Not just from the aspect of property rights, but for the public good, over-regulation leads to gentrification. It leads to sprawl and some other negative consequences for the greater common good. But there's a million ways in which, right? So even something as simple as parking. If you can't have a store without X number of parking spots, that's going to shape the way the design is, or whether people buy the property or what they want to do with it. So there are more pervasive ways than we may realize that property rights are subject to this control.
Just to add two quick ones, amortization. I mean, having the government be able to say, yeah, we don't want this type of business here anymore. We're just going to put the countdown clock on it and just destroy that use. Just, because we don't want it, like what happened to Hinga Automotive. Texas needs to stamp that out. I mean, this is eminent domain by another name, and it's happening across the United States. But in Texas, it just, it's profoundly offensive to the history and tradition of protecting property rights. The other one, which is a more modern example, is short-term rental. This is, especially when properties get more expensive, being able to monetize your property or let other people use it because you're not using it, it helps elevate the best use of that property, and people making a little bit extra money should be fine. Again, you've got people in neighborhoods that may not want that, but if you're living on your property, that should be fine. And fundamentally, there's other ways, less restrictive ways, that the government can deal with short-term rentals without saying no. I think those two things need to be addressed. With historic districts, I see there's a question about what the legislature can do. One of the best things you could do for historic districts is, for historic districts, not landmarks, those should be opt-in only. If there's landmarks within the district, they're already protected. So if someone wants to encumber their own property by choice, they can opt in, so that when someone buys that house in the future, they're on full notice that they're subject to all these rules. Don't force them upon people. But if people don't want to opt in, then they shouldn't have to suffer the consequences of bad policymaking or subjective ways to enforce onerous rules about the character of a neighborhood. The character of the neighborhood is rooted in the individuals in that neighborhood. Those individuals have individual property rights that are protected. And so the legislature could stamp out historic districts or abusive use of historic districts by making it a scenario where people have to opt into it if they choose, but not forced into one, period. And that would do a lot of good.
And well said. And I don't know the answer to this one, so I'll throw it open to the group. Someone asks, does this issue have any influence on open space or wildlife habitat? or is it a future threat to either? Does anybody want to tackle that one?
Yeah. Go ahead, Chance. And I'll give an example of it in Austin.
Go ahead.
Governments use eminent domain under the pretext of a real public use when they're really trying to accomplish something else. So in Austin, there's this old building. It was a military barrack from Bastrop that had been moved to this piece of land down in southeast Austin. And it was a segregation era school. And someone had bought the land and the city owned some of the land, and he wanted to develop around this thing. And he agreed to preserve the school and make it a landmark. And so the city of Austin, kind of bending to the pressure of preservation, and said, we're just going to take this whole parcel of land where you can add some homes and just develop this huge piece of land. We're just going to say this is open space because we're going to make it a historic museum. They haven't done anything. The purpose of that public use was to extinguish and keep open space when all they were trying to do is extinguish what the property owner wanted to do with their land. But they couldn't do it using their normal tools. So they had to resort to eminent domain and pretend that there was a legitimate public use. This is a pretextual taking. And so, that is a big problem. And that's where you kind of see the intersection of using historic preservation arguments in the context of eminent domain just to stop development. Using eminent domain, which is not usually something that you often see in the historic preservation context, but that's an example of how you're trying to extinguish a project or extinguish an idea and development using eminent domain, even outside of the landmarking and district context.
I would just note that, look, and Professor Festa mentioned this earlier, people have to live somewhere. People have to live somewhere. And so you can choose whether or not you want to build out already developed areas and have walkable cities and affordable housing and multifamily units and things like that, or you can build sprawl and open spaces. So if you really care about these things and you really care about making sure that people have affordable housing and things like that, you need to cut down on these regulations and allow them to build out in existing footprints. And then you don't have as many questions about open space because you're not having to build out there because you've been boxed out of huge segments of the city due to historic land use regulation.
Gents, we got time for one more question. And Professor, I think this one might be for you. If you can answer in 2 minutes or less, I know our comms team would much appreciate it. Here's the question. If the same type of aesthetic regulation would be permissible under an HOA, why did the Heights not form an HOA instead of petitioning for a historic district? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I'll try and be even quicker to let somebody else chime in, but not knowing the subjective history of that, I think that says it all about why the government needs to impose these things. Anybody can form an HOA if they get the votes, if they get consent, but it's a contract. An HOA is private and it requires the consent of every property owner. And if you can't get that, then that's where zoning comes in, for good or for ill.
I think that is 100% the answer, because it would have been harder for them to get the HOA, and it would have been a binding contract that would have bound their properties as well. And so instead of going through the private contract process, and we see this so often with all sorts of land use regulations, they run down to the city hall and have, because of regulatory capture and things like that, they can actually get the city to impose regulations that people in that district would have never agreed to through the HOA process. So it's a way to use the guns and the force of the government to do something that they couldn't get people to voluntarily agree to. So that's why.
All right, gentlemen, I think we are just about out of time. I want to say thank you for your time and your talent. You guys, again, are some of the sharpest people that I know, and I am fortunate to call you friends. So on behalf of everyone who just got to learn from your wisdom, thank you. And to our audience, we will see you next time. Thanks again.
Thank you.